We've got some Gophers recruiting updates, including some prospects who have moved away from Minnesota, who's still left on from the OV visits. We're diving in today.
Hey,
You are Locked On Golden Gophers.
No matter what we're going to do here, we're just going to keep rowing.
Your daily podcast on the Minnesota Golden Gophers.
However it turns out, we're just going to keep rowing.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
We're just going to keep rowing, and keep rowing.
What's up, Gopher fans? You're listening to Locked On Golden Gophers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name's Kane Rob, host of the podcast, former collegiate football video coordinator and recruiting assistant, here to talk Golden Gophers with you each and every day of the week, Monday through Friday. Now, in the offseason, we switch it up a little bit. We have less Gophers news coming in, and so we are doing 3 days a week. So you'll have shows for these next 3 days to cover this week, and then we'll be back at it again next week. But what we're talking about today is what is the Gophers' offensive preference for the fans. So we're going to dive into that. I'll get a little bit more into what that means, but I also want to give you updates on recruiting, including the names that are still on the board for the 2025 class that have visited Minnesota and others who have already committed elsewhere. And then finally, we're going to talk about the latest commit for the Gophers. He's from the class of 2026, and the Gophers have the top 2 kids in Minnesota locked in for not only this year in 2025, but also next year's class of 2026. We're diving into all of it today, so be sure to hit subscribe over on YouTube so you don't miss any of your daily Gophers content moving forward. Now, let's talk about this offensive preference stuff first. I want to dive into what is your preference as a fan? I have 3 options for you, and I just want to get your thoughts here. So there's 3 different options we're looking at. First is option A, which is a quarterback passing for 2,400 pass yards and 15 touchdowns, running backs on the team with 1,500 plus yards rushing, 500 yards plus rushing, and 50 yards plus rushing. So the top 3 backs would have that type of split, plus 25 to 28 touchdowns between those running backs. And then also 3 wide receivers with over 600 plus receiving yards and some here and there yards for the running backs and tight ends. Now that's option A. So give that a moment, let it seep in. But then option B, I'm thinking this offense would have a quarterback of 2,800 plus passing yards with 18 to 22 passing touchdowns. So it's about 5 to 7 more touchdowns passing through the air and about 400 yards passing more. But on the flip side, the running backs would have a 1,200 plus yard rusher, a 250 plus yard rusher, and a 150 plus yard rusher. So a little bit less rushing across the board, but still over 1,000 from your top guy. And the next 2 guys have 250 and 150 yards plus, and then a total of 20 to 22 touchdowns on the ground between your running backs. And then finally, 1 wide receiver over 1,000 yards receiving and 2 other receivers in that 400 plus yards receiving, and then 300 plus yards to your running backs or tight ends. So that's option B. We've heard option A, option B, and then the final option is option C. Now, your quarterback to pass for 3,400 plus passing yards and 25 to 28 passing touchdowns. Then you have your 3 leading rushers with 700 plus yards rushing, 200 plus yards rushing, and 100 plus yards rushing. And then finally, no receivers over 800 yards, but 4 wide receivers plus 1 tight end plus 1 running back, all over 300 yards receiving, and a total of 15 rushing touchdowns amongst your 3 running backs. See, option A, option B, and option C are really just the 3 different styles of offensive approach in a rush-heavy approach, a balanced approach, or a pass-heavy approach. So did any of those stand out to you when you're hearing those numbers? Did any of them make you go, ooh, I would love to see that? Because in my opinion, looking at these 3 options, option B should be by far and away the best option of an offense for this Minnesota team. Because see, among these 3 options, choice B is that balanced approach in which you don't know how the team is going to attack you. You have multiple weapons, some high-end talent. We're talking about a running back who has over 1,200 rushing yards, about 20 to 22 touchdowns amongst the running backs in that room. Plus you have 1 receiver over 1,000 yards. Now, yes, your quarterback doesn't hit 3,000 passing yards, but 2,800 passing yards is still top notch. And then having 18 to 22 passing touchdowns, it shows that you can be attacking from every which way. And that should make others fear uh, how to defend you. It makes them consider how they try to take things away. And the two facets of the offense are then playing off of each other. So I think that's by far and away the best. Now, ironically, option A is actually very similar to what we saw from the Gophers in 2022. It's just that the quarterback numbers were spread across two different quarterbacks in Tanner Morgan and Ethan Kaliakmanis because of injuries and what have you. Now, the ground game dominated, and there were moments from the pass catchers, but nothing that makes you fear the air attack. So if you picked option A, you're actually saying you prefer how the Gophers have run things in the past. And if you pick option C on the flip side, option C was actually ironically very similar to the numbers that New Hampshire put up last year with Max Brosmer. Now, you would love to see that passing air attack. You would love to have quite the difference in the passing game than what Minnesota has had for years and years with Coach Fleck, but how effective would it be in the Big Ten is my biggest question there. Because for the pass game, it's cool that you can spread it out and attack from different facets, but the run game is the foundation, not only here with Minnesota, but also in the Big Ten. And you have to be able to run effectively at some capacity in order to find success in the Big Ten if you want to be competitive. Now, some might counter me and be like, well, Ohio State has always had a high passing offense, and they still have a lot of ground and pound run game usage. But that being said, if you want to be able to be a high powered passing offense in the Big Ten Conference, then you have to have multiple elite NFL level wide receivers across your wide receiver room. And I don't know if that's something the Gophers have at this given point in time. And I can only think of one or two schools, maybe Oregon, maybe Ohio State in the whole conference that might have that. So ultimately, you have to have some semblance of a running game and some success on the ground. So I think that balance is everything. Now, not only that, but the production from option B also gives you talking points for offensive recruiting targets for years to come, because quarterbacks, you can tell them, look, see, we do throw the ball and we give you many different pro style concepts, play action concepts, under center concepts, read option concepts, all of that in different play styles within the offense that will only help you in the long-term goals of wanting to play some sort of pro capacity football. Now, running backs, you can say, look at our storied history with the running backs and running the rock effectively and finding production across multiple running backs, but usually having a workhorse who kind of takes over the room. Then on top of that, wide receivers, you can say there is enough production when we have the right guys in the room and you are the right guy. Look at Daniel Jackson, look at Tyler Johnson, look at Rashad Bateman. When we've had the guys in there, we can get them the ball and they have found ways to move on to the next level. And then finally, tight ends, this is where you can get your all-around development. This is the best suit for any pro aspirations because it's not just about receiving and catching the ball. You have to learn how to block effectively, and that will help you get to pro aspirations because if you can block, you can be on the field for more snaps. So overall, it has different perspectives that should only help you in the recruiting if you can find that balance. Now, Minnesota desperately needs to find balance this season, and it seems like they have the personnel to do it. It seems like they want to do it. It seems like the quarterback has the experience to make the right decisions and the call on the field and read pre-snap and what have you. It seems they have the running back room built to withstand injuries. And yet, with all of that said, I still have to wait and see it before I can believe it, because that is how much we have been away from it over the course of Coach Fleck in his era here in the 7 years he's been here. So hopefully year 8 is where we actually see it and we start to believe a little bit that the offense can change. Now, I know we saw it a little bit in 2019, but the passing attempts still weren't there. Now, we saw high efficiency, but we didn't actually see, we saw some balance. I'll give you that. 2019 is the year we've seen it, but again, it was high efficiency rather than finding balance in the attempts as well when it comes to passing the ball. So this year is critical for the Gophers from a success standpoint. You have to have success because of the recruiting, because of financial support, because of player retention, because of coach retention. Being in this newer, bigger Big Ten conference, you have to start out hot. You have to find success and you have to be competitive. In the new Big Ten, starting strong could be the ultimate guide to remaining competitive in the long run, because if you start in the cellar, it may be a long, slow process of climbing out. So hopefully Minnesota can find some balance in the passing offense, and it all starts this season. Now, I want to talk about names we are still waiting for in the recruiting game with the 2025 class from these first two official visits, as well as a couple names that have already committed elsewhere. We're diving into that coming up next. First, I want to talk to you about our friends over at eBay Motors, because passion, drive, and patience is the formula for winning championships, and it's also what helps keep your vehicle alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. You've got superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, whatever you can think of, they've got you covered over at eBay Motors, and they have the best guarantee with their eBay Guaranteed Fit. With over 122 million parts for your vehicle, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. But with that Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your vehicle every single time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash, and they've got everything for you when it comes to speed, power, or style. They've got you covered. So definitely go over and keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply, and the eBay Guaranteed Fit is for U.S. customers only. All right, Gophers fans, don't forget to head on over to Locked On Minnesota Sports, where you can find a 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube to always talk about the latest and greatest things when it comes to Minnesota sports, from the Timberwolves to the Wild to the Gophers to the Vikings and so much more. They've got you covered with 24/7 streaming over at Locked On Minnesota Sports, and you can catch some clips from this show over there as well. But we're diving into the names that we're still waiting on to make a commitment decision from those first two official visits. Now, there are some names that have committed elsewhere, a couple that were high priority guys for Minnesota. Micah Rice being a big name that a lot of people have heard of, safety prospect. He was a 4-star guy from Ohio. He is no longer on the board as he officially committed to Louisville. Minnesota was in his top 3, but they don't make the final cut. He's headed to Louisville with Brahms out there, and so that kind of stinks, but we'll see what happens. Isaiah Groves, running back. He might have been the highest running back priority for the Gophers potentially in this class. He's no longer on the board as he committed to Georgia Tech. You've also got Sirius Stinyard, a cornerback, who is no longer on the board as he committed to West Virginia. And then finally, Michael O'Connell, an offensive lineman, is no longer on the board as he committed to Northwestern. So those are the guys who took visits here in Minnesota, but ultimately ended up elsewhere. Now, there's still players who haven't quite made their decision. Running back Kentrell Reinhardt is a name that we've mentioned here on the show. He has officially been crystal balled to North Carolina State. He is visiting North Carolina State with an official visit this weekend, but he also has Iowa, Syracuse, and Minnesota in consideration. Now, I've mentioned before he had 2,837 rush yards last year, but the whopping factor was 42 rushing touchdowns. The dude can punch it into the end zone. I would love his upside, especially knowing when he comes in, would probably potentially be Darius Taylor's last year as the running back for the Gophers if he's headed to the NFL early with the production of this year and another year after that. So I would love for Reinhardt to commit to the Gophers and be kind of maybe the next man up. He said he doesn't shy away from the competition. Yes, the Gophers have 2 other running back commits, but he would be the highest ranked commit by far, and we'll see if that happens. But like I said, he's crystal balled to North Carolina State. Now, some other guys that we're still waiting on that haven't really gotten an answer, no crystal balls. We don't know what's happening officially. And that is Terrence Smith is the first one I want to talk about, a wide receiver from Illinois. He's considering Minnesota and Iowa. Now, he recently got an offer from Purdue as well, though they might be a little too late to the party. He is visiting Iowa this upcoming weekend. So right now, my gut tells me he's probably 65% leaning Iowa, 35% leaning Minnesota, and we'll see what happens there? Yeah, I was a little bit closer to home for him. I was passing offense, though, has been worse than Minnesota's, which could be a positive for Minnesota, but we'll see what happens with Terrence Smith probably in the near future. Now, another name that is going to be committing relatively soon is Derry Norris. He is officially making his commitment on June 28th. He announced via Twitter. Now, he has it down to Georgia Tech, Miami, and Minnesota. Now, Minnesota was the last official visit for him, so that could play in their favor. But at the same time, it's going to be really hard to beat out Miami for a native Florida kid. And then finally, if you solely went off of social medias, well, the only one he's really shared anything on over on Twitter is Georgia Tech. So maybe that could be the most likely. But overall, I think having Coach Winston Delatibadier, who would be his position coach, at least gives the Gophers a shot, depending on how strong that relationship is. But I would say my confidence is at 40% at most that Minnesota could land him. Now, another name that's on the list is Jermecco Green, a running back from Texas. He tweeted out 6 schools after his Minnesota visit, saying those 6 schools are kind of where he'll be choosing for his next home. It's Minnesota, Houston, TCU, Utah, Arizona, and Oregon State. Now, he has an official visit with Arizona this weekend. He is the highest rated running back left on Minnesota's radar if Reinhardt does go elsewhere. But my confidence level with him coming to Minnesota is very, very low. I would say the Gophers have a 10% chance of Jermecco coming this way because I ultimately believe he'll end up at a Texas school. He's from Texas. He has 2 different Texas schools in his highest consideration. SMU used to be in consideration, another Texas school. It seems like he would rather play closer to home. And if they are a competitive offer, and if he has the desire to play close to home, I have a hard time believing that he would come up this way to Minnesota. So 10% is my guess for him. And 2 more names I want to bring up. Donovan Robinson, linebacker from Illinois. He is crystal balled to Virginia, but he only has Washington and Minnesota listed as schools for heavy consideration. Now, he's visiting both Washington and Virginia officially this weekend, apparently. He was initially committed to Virginia over most of the spring, but he decommitted on June 3rd. Then he came here to an official visit last weekend, and he is planning to make a decision before the end of the month after he finishes his visit. So again, a player will have an answer on sooner than later. Now, my confidence level here is probably around a 30%. I think that he very likely he could wind back at Virginia after visiting some other schools and seeing kind of what else is out there. But he did seem to have a pretty good time at the official visit, spoke with Ryan Burns, so definitely was willing to talk about his experience here, and it seemed like it went pretty well. So Minnesota may have a shot in the race. And then finally, Sean Hammerback, offensive lineman from South Dakota. He is considering Nebraska, Minnesota, and Texas Tech. He will be on his last visit at Texas Tech this weekend. He's on the verge of a 4-star offensive lineman, 6'6", but only 245 pounds. So he needs to get bigger and put on more weight, but he does have the talent. My confidence level that he'll be a Gopher is pretty low, 20%. I think he's heavily considering Nebraska, if I'm being 100% honest with you. And seeing how many offensive lineman commitments that Minnesota has in this 2025 class, I would not be surprised to see him kind of X them out if he has a good experience with one of those 2 other schools where he might have a better shot at getting on the field sooner. Now, Minnesota is already starting to turn its eyes towards the future in future classes. They recently just offered a 2027 quarterback, and they also gained another commit from the class of 2026, making it 2. We're going to talk about that new addition coming up next. All right, Gophers fans, we are wrapping it up talking about a commit, but it's for the class of 2026. So 2 years from now. Now that feels like a long ways away and anything could happen, but at the same time, this one feels different. Now, Howie Johnson of Forest Lake commits to Minnesota. He was at the second in-state fall or summer camp that Minnesota had, and he was offered there. Now, he is also the second in-state recruit of this 2026 class to commit to Minnesota. Now, he is early and he jumps on, and it shows that Minnesota is highly prioritizing the trenches now that they have a offensive lineman and a defensive lineman. And if you look at their 2025 class, you will find multiple defensive linemen. I believe there's 6, and multiple offensive linemen. I believe there's 4 or 5 committed already. So the trenches are huge huge emphasis for this Minnesota team, and it looks like they're continuing to do that moving forward into 2026. Now, their first commit was Andrew Trout. We've talked about him on the show. He is an offensive lineman, 6'6", nearly 300 pounds as a sophomore last season. Sophomore, soon to be junior, 4-star guy, heavy, talented player. Now, the latest commit is a defensive lineman on the verge of being a 4-star. And honestly, he probably should be rated a 4-star if you're actually looking at what he has done, how strong he is, the numbers he put up, which is absolutely bonkers as a sophomore. But Howie Johnson is a defensive lineman, 6'3", 255 pounds. He was offered, like I said, at Minnesota's latest camp and committed on the spot. Now, he said it was his dream to play for Minnesota, play for the home school. His numbers as a sophomore were pretty nutty as a defensive lineman. 80 total tackles, 28 tackles for loss. That is insane. And on top of that, he had 7 sacks. This dude still has 2 years left of high school ball, and I would drastically expect his ranking to rise if he continues to improve on those numbers, and also expect other offers to tick up. Now, that could make Minnesota fans a little bit nervous, but it seems like he knows he wants to be here in Minnesota, and that is exactly where he wants to be. He said he's grown up a Gopher fan, and it was his inspiration to play Division I football was knowing he wanted to be a Gopher. And it also helps that Coach Winston DeLativitiere is his position coach. That man has been on a roll in recruiting due to his genuine relationship building. So I think overall, I feel really good when he says that he's shutting down his recruiting process, even as a heading to be junior. It seems like it's for real, and it seems like he is locked in. This high upside defensive lineman is here to stay. Howie Johnson, Andrew Trout, 2 2026 guys that could be the future of the Gophers program in the far away future. But that's going to do it for us here on Locked On Golden Gophers. I hope you enjoyed the show. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about the 2025 class so far, what I like, what are the needs, what are some of the expectations I have, but also we're going to talk about how Minnesota is building in the trenches. And then finally, we're going to talk about the Gophers ceiling in 2024. So I'll see you tomorrow when we dive into all that. Until then, row the boat, Sky Umago Gophers as always, and don't forget to hit subscribe.